Now, say for example, I have done something like this, where I have these two shapes that I have a loop expression on them, so they are constantly repeating. If I twirl down, I have applied a loop out ping pong on each of them just to get them to continually move. But say for example, I have these two shapes, right? And they are working in concert together. I think they're kind of exciting. I could, constantly duplicate them if I wanted to put them elsewhere on my canvas. So if I select both my shapes and I do Command or Control D, notice it makes some duplicates, and then I can move them down here, and I'm using the arrow keys to do that, right? And then if I want to duplicate it again, I could do Control or Command D. But now look how many layers I have. I have 6 layers that I have now created, and it's kind of difficult to figure out what goes with what. So inside After Effects, the easier way to group objects together, especially if you start having more complicated motions, and I'm just going to, rather than undo that, delete that, is to pre-composite them together, to turn them into their own composition. So what I can do is I'm going to select my 2 layers, these ones that are the 2 that are moving in and out of each other, and those are just scales that are offset. So notice if I press U when I see them, this one is 100, and then when this one is big, this one goes to 0. So I select both of them, I right click, and then I do pre-compose. And it's going to ask me, what do you want to do with them? And so I want to first give it a title, give it a new name. So I'm going to call this Scaling Circles. And although one's a rounded rectangle, I know that. And then it's going to ask me a couple things. Move all attributes into the new composition. And that is yes, I want to move these 2 layers into this new composition. And I'm going to say okay. And so now you see that nothing has changed, right? All that has happened is it has created a new composition called Scaling Circles. And if I double click on this, you will see it has made this new element here, right inside its own composition. So when I come back, it's still there, but these are just isolated out from everything else. So here you'll see that it has made my new shapes here, and it's much easier to duplicate this form and drag it down over here. And one thing I may want to do, you'll notice that this has been a little, since I'm doing this a little bit backwards, it's done it a little bit wonky, where I have made this the same size as my composition. So what I can do is I'm going to go back in and reset it a little bit. But if I go back into my composition and I want to select both my shapes, move them to the center of my composition, and then I'm going to change the size of my composition. So I can go Composition and Composition Settings, or right click and Composition Settings. And then I'm just going to scale this down so it's a little bit smaller. So 400 pixels by 400 pixels. And this is where if I also needed to change the duration, I could do that as well. And you'll see that it's much more easier to manage with something like this. And if I come back to my exercise, it's moved it, but now everything is centered. And so when I now go to duplicate it, and I just did Command D, I can move this over here, Command D, move this over here. And now I've got 3 layers that are all together, right? And if I wanted to just change the timing, I could offset them a tiny bit. So I'm clicking and dragging this layer back, dragging this one a little bit back. So now they're all happening at slightly different rates. It's just added a whole lot more animation to my scene. Now you could also start out with those from the very beginning, right? You could say, I know I'm going to do these star things. I'm going to do those on a smaller composition and then bring it into a larger one. It's really up to you depending on how you work. Now, one last thing I want to show is sometimes you may want to do a type of movement that is, if I'm looking at this, maybe I want to pan down this whole piece. So what I could do is think about having this whole image move through another composition rather than trying to make everything here move at the same time. And I'm going to show you specifically what I mean. So I'm going to lock my top layers, go to my dotted line, and as an example, if I go to Let's go to shape. Let's go to my stroke, and I'm going to add some dashes, and let's increase this or decrease the size of my stroke. We can increase the amount of dashes. That's pretty good. We'll do something like that. And let's do round caps. So I think that looks a little bit nicer. And I'm going to go back in and add a trim paths, and I'm going to click just on the name of the shape first and trim paths. Drop this down, go all the way to 0, and then start. And then when it gets to 3 seconds, this is going to move all the way through. Let's just make sure this is all the way set to 0. So what this will look like is this is going to go through this line here. So what I want is this whole scene to be shown in another animation, but panning down along with this frame. So what I can do is make a new composition, and let's just make this one 800 by 800. And inside here, this is, I'm going to call it master comp, or I could call it like viewer, you could call it whatever you want. And I'm going to take my exercise and drag it into the master comp here, or I can drag it right on the timeline. And you'll see how it's bigger than what I have. And I could even do something like just stretch it out so it's even larger like this. And I'm going to start with it here. And notice there is my, actually let's shrink it down a little bit. Hold down shift. So now the red is there. I'm going to hit a position keyframe. So it's actually going to start at the very top here. And now let's go through. I knew that one was at 3 seconds. And I can pan this up like so. So now this is going to follow that shape as it moves down. And I might have to adjust that timing a little bit. Notice how it's moving a little bit more quickly. So maybe I want it to actually start a little bit later. So it's going to go, and then as soon as it starts going, then it's going to come down and move it. So this is where you have to think about how you're embedding sort of images together. And that looks way more interesting than just something like this. So this is the idea of nesting compositions together, right? You can have as many compositions as you want. It's thinking procedurally, right? If you're going to repeat something, don't copy and paste all the layers over. You can just have one. And so I can make one simple change inside the scaling circles. If I didn't want them to be orange, I could change this to green and then come back. And now all of these have changed to green inside. And that is now also reflected in my master composition.